Hello and welcome back to the YouTube studio here at Munich Security Conference. I'm Jack Kelly from TLDR News, and this time I'm joined by Pakistan's Minister for Foreign Affairs, Hina Rabbani Khar. Very nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us. I'd like to start with kind of the big topic of the conference, the war in Ukraine. For the most part, Pakistan seems to have taken a relatively neutral stance on the war and hasn't followed the Western-led sanctions, as well as not explicitly criticizing Putin for his measures. Could you explain to us Pakistan's kind of position on the matter, as well as why it's refrained from towing the Western line?
Okay, so I think any country must and should refrain from towing anyone's line. I think it's important to be clear and honest in your pursuits of foreign policy and in the stances that you take. And I think Pakistan is a country which is not a terribly large country. Pakistan is a country which is also resource constrained in many ways. Pakistan is a country which is also in a very interesting geopolitical environment. Now, we are also a country which has the threat of a really large, big country, which has become very aggressive in the last many years, and which has actually gone out into an annexed or re-annexed what is Jammu and Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir, which is, according to the Security Council resolution, a disputed territory. Now, when all of that happened and we wanted to take resolutions to the United Nations, we saw no one standing up for the values that we all profess to be standing for. Pakistan is a country which believes in multilateral solutions, right? So I think it's very important that we want the framework of the world governance structure to actually start delivering, to actually start working. Now, when it comes to this crisis also, we have seen the cost of war on our borders for 20 plus years. And we have seen after that, and there were really good words used when that entire war was being, sort of the war was happening. And there was a value system, and there was fighting for democracy, fighting for women, fighting for girls' right to education. And then we saw one fine day, everybody depart without looking at what they had left behind. And then now you see in Pakistan a comeback of terrorist incidents, which have been created from the vacuum that was left behind. Now, interestingly, this is not the first time that this happened. It happened 40 years back after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and how the world came together and then decided to leave altogether. So meaning this is really important, that we are able to not just go in, create more war, not try for cessation of hostilities, and then expect everyone who has seen those values not to be played out in the real arena when it came to their region, play along, because we don't know how long this would last. This interest, and once this interest wanes, we fear that a lot of Ukrainian and other lives would have been lost.
And more generally, do you think there's similar reasons? Do you think they have similar reasons for not doing the same thing in other Asian and African countries? Predominantly in those areas of the world, you are seeing a number of countries deciding not to go along with the Western line.
Look, if you want to be completely honest about it, the fact is that the biggest threat to everybody not doing something together is because the universality of the values or the rules-based order has not been applied on the ground. It has not been applied in the interventions that have happened. So the rest of the world is perhaps not as clear-headed or has seen, I think it's a peculiar nature of most Western countries that they apply the value system and the rules-based order and the laws and the rules within their own geographical borders. But when they go outside of it, it's a very different playout, right? Which is very similar to the ones which are generally considered to be, all the wrong words. So I think that's why the difference between the response of the rest of the world and sort of mostly European countries is because of that.
More broadly, though, obviously the relationship between Pakistan and the United States is an important one. Recently, your foreign minister remarked to VOA News that for too long, US-Pakistan relations have been colored by the events of Afghanistan, and it's time to move beyond that. Do you think that's something that's going to happen? And how do you see the US-Pakistan relationship evolving from here?
I think that's something that is perhaps already happening. I think as the US interest and presence in Afghanistan has waned. The bilateral track between US and Pakistan is back in action, etc. Now, that still doesn't meaning that still doesn't, there is an impact of the departure in the way it happened. So Afghanistan will remain on the realm in every regional and international conversation, at least for us, because we continue to pay the price for those adventures. But yes, I think the foreign minister was absolutely right in saying that dehyphenation of Pakistan's relationship with any other country vis-a-vis the US is something that we've seen into play.
And are you optimistic about that relationship going forward with the United States?
I have no reason why not to be optimistic, because I think what needs to be understood is that every country must be able to make its own choices. That's the whole concept of sovereignty. So when we say, oh, why are you not towing my line? That is like saying, why are you being yourself, right? Now, it seems exceptionally wrong, but today, even in Munich, the space for an alternate narrative or even an alternate truth and an alternate reality check has actually contracted. I don't say Munich, specifically Munich, but as someone who's been coming to the Munich Security Conference for a few years now, it's remarkable. 3 years back, if you'd asked me that these are the type of conversations that we would be having, that we'd be celebrating military spending and that we would be talking about, just everybody being exceptionally militarized in their thinking and aggressive in many ways, and the decoupling of the world and the blocks and the confrontational approach and the good and the bad and us and them. Seriously, remarkable. It seems like as if human civilization is moving backwards, right? There are always options. There are always options which can be reached through negotiation. I mean, the whole question of China, for instance, right now is an important one, because China is not another country which doesn't has, or other countries do not have interest. The interest, we did connect the world. You cannot, there's not a button to disconnect, right? But I was quite sort of happy to speak to many German companies who said, we continue to do business, right? As we did before. If 40% of our trade is with China, we continue 40% of that particular company that I'm referring to. So let's see how this plays out. But from where we're sitting, from our vantage point, we are genuinely concerned about the us versus them and the decoupling and the talk of that. And I think in order to build a cohesive force, it may be useful to be able to understand each other's perspective, to be able to understand each other's threat perception, and then to apply universally our value system on no matter where the threat is coming from. What we're seeing right now is if a country is of geopolitical interest, strategic interest in the Indo-Pacific regime or anywhere else, then they can get away with murder. And nobody's value system will be threatened by that, right? So that's what's perhaps not playing out very well.
And you talk about China, obviously an important partner of yours as well. In fact, it's often been described as an all-weather strategic cooperative partnership.
It is indeed an all-weather strategic cooperative partner.
Absolutely. And how do you think that's going to progress going forward as well? What do you see in the future for the Sino-Pakistan relationship?
Look, it's very interesting because from where we sit, they say from where you stand depends on where you sit geographically, right? And interestingly, when I look around in my own region, no matter where I look, barring India, which obviously has many has competitive edge with China, barring India, everyone that I meet within my region and beyond, but the closer region, so all the way up to the boundary of Europe, let's say, right? On the far, mostly, certainly in South Asia, many African countries, which are obviously further away, depending on which way you're looking. China is seen to be a source of stability and progress and development and connectivity and infrastructure development. Now, these are all things that any developing country craves for. These are all things that any developing country needs for its own people to develop. So we do not see them in the light that they're portrayed in. So Pakistan, many other countries like Pakistan have been colonized by other countries. We know what colonization feels like. Yeah. We do not feel colonized by China. So it's really important that we are able to not build false narratives and go into this notional, no, we know they're evil. No one is evil. What we see on the ground is how we will react to, whether it's an entity is a force of evil or a force of good.
And keeping that in mind and balancing the kind of US and China side of this, do you think that's going to be increasingly difficult to balance those two relationships as the two become increasingly
It will be
competitive?
increasingly difficult, but my question is, which type of a world are we living in? Why do we have to balance out anything? I mean, we're a country which is a sovereign country, which should be able to do business with one and the other, be able to have strategic ties and with one and have ties wherever is required with the other. And so it's almost like I have young children. So it's almost like, you know, when two children are saying, oh, if you want to be my friend, but I'm not friendly with that, so you cannot be friendly with them. And if you're friendly with them, then you're not friendly with me. So sometimes I feel the things that I say to my 9-year-old and 12-year-old is what needs to be told to world leaders.
And are you concerned that that will be a feature in the future that will continue down that path of relationships?
Realism tells me yes. Hope tells me I hope not.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's move on from this topic. Over the last few years, we've seen a significant rise in global food prices, which has had a tragic impact on living standards in Pakistan and other areas of the world as well. Now, fortunately, UN data suggests that things are starting to reverse course and some food prices are coming down again. But are you concerned about global food stability generally? And do you think that the issues with climate change could make these crises worse in the future?
Okay, so let me give you a report card.
Yeah.
I was in this session which talked about food and climate nexus also. And the number of people who were acutely stressed in terms of food shortage and food security was 195 million in 2019. Do you know what the number is right now in 2022? 345 million. When I saw that number, I almost did not believe it. I verified my sources. It was being quoted by WFP and was the source which was leading into OCHA, UN OCHA. And this number was used on the same panel as me was the WFP person. And he also was quoting this number. Now, this is our report card. So how well we doing in the world? That's the report card.
Yeah.
And what do we want to consume our energy with? Confrontation. These are choices that we're making. These are costly choices. The threat of climate change looming. We've seen a pandemic which tells us that shocks are going to be the name of the game, are going to be regular. We have been threatened by a food crisis and an oil crisis, which is somewhat of our own making. We are running into sanction regimes one after the other at a pace that we cannot control or cannot keep up with. And there's absolutely no looking back as what has it created in terms of what chaos it has created. Now, Pakistan, for instance, if it's a country which like any normal country wants to trade on the east and on the west, and in the north and in the south. In the south, we have the Arabian Sea. On the east, we have a belligerent, roguish India in Modi's form, which with the BBC documentary, I think has clarified as to how they operate to real, events. Up north, we have China, and most of the messaging is, oh, they're trying to colonize you because you have, so that seems to be. On the east, we have, on the west, we have Iran, heavily sanctioned. We should be having oil pipelines with them. That is what our people need. Unable to do that because of highly regulated sanction regimes. Then we have Afghanistan, because of the decades of war-like, intervention, everything else that has been created over there. In 1960s, none of us, we all think of Afghanistan in the form that it is today. In the 1960s, if you see images of Afghanistan, you would not believe it. They were far more developed than many, many, many very developed countries today.
Sure.
Okay? This is what conflict does. So when you ask us, why are you not standing to fuel more conflict in Europe? That is why our answer is, we have learned from our own experience that any amount of war, when you trigger war, when you give weapons, those weapons will go into hands which will not be in your control then. And then the whole texture and fabric of the society changes. And you cannot, once you cast the die, you cannot bring it back.
And specifically on food security in Pakistan, are you worried that that's an issue that's going to get worse over time?
It's an issue which is already getting worse. Yeah. I mean, that's what I'm saying. These threats are real. We're experiencing them on a daily basis. The cost of living, our inflation rates have never been what they are right now because we're getting imported inflation. And then we had, on top of that, Pakistan had the unique experience of being in these remarkable floods. 33 million people affected. No rice this time because most of the rice growing area was under lake-like conditions for months, and still some parts of Pakistan are literally inundated because this was below sea level. So remarkable challenges. I think back about it because I think back about it, and there was a time 10 years back when one single event like this would have really shook the world. I think we become very unable to be shocked by anything because it's become such a norm. Earthquakes, floods, confrontation, war, weaponization. We are weaponizing trade, connectivity, and everything which was supposed to be good for humanity. So I genuinely believe, I'm not going to underestimate the importance of how dangerous the times are. And right now, we are perhaps not at the irretrievable damage point, but I think we are fast waltzing into a zone which will then be irretrievable.
On the point of food security and obviously the climate impacts that are going to make that worse, earlier this month, Reuters reported that Pakistan plans to quadruple its domestic coal fuel powered facilities instead of investing in sustainable techniques such as natural gas infrastructure. Now, that probably has something to do with the fact that natural gas is getting a lot more expensive, largely because the West is spending a lot more on the global markets rather than buying from Russia. What do you think of the current strategy being pursued by your country? And also, do you think the West should be doing more to support developing countries when it comes to the green transition?
Okay, the answer to the last is absolutely yes. And I think when we say should be doing more, we mean should be doing more not only on paper, but should be doing more in translating into real, discernible transfer of technology, creating resources, enabling resources, whether in private sector or any other sector. So that's one, because your question was multi-tiered, right?
Yes.
Now, the other question related to that was that why is it going for coal? I think the Reuters report missed a small detail, and that is that Pakistan intends to have 50,000 megawatts of solar energy, and that has already started working, right? So we are trying to go as renewable as is virtually possible, as is possible in every which way. So I look at Pakistan as a country which is a case study waiting to happen. And if the right resources were to be able to come in, we are exceptionally keen to move away completely from anything which is based on imported coal, imported energy, imported gas, imported oil, and move to renewable sources, whether it's hydro, solar, wind. Now, why are we not able to do that? It's because of lack of resources and lack of that technology transfer that should be fairly easy for a developing country, but it is not. So just to create, so in terms of policy, we're moving fast towards renewable. Now, you said an interesting thing that could it be because of the diversion of, Pakistan had many LNG contracts which were diverted to Europe because better prices were asked. So when Europe becomes energy secure, it is at the cost of making many countries energy insecure. I just want you to take, absorb that.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's always at a cost of someone else. Okay, we have absolutely no way to be able to keep up with the cost escalation that has happened. And typically when somebody's getting like 2 times what they had negotiated and were in a long-term deal with us, they will pay us the price fine. And that we have seen a lot of that happen.
And when it comes to the support the West should be offering, you mentioned technology. Is that the most important thing when it comes to the green transition, or is there other things the West ought to be doing?
Look, when it comes to green transition and we say, okay, we want to create a green climate fund and we want to put this much money in renewable energy. So all of those things are really good headlines. So unfortunately, for a country like us, we have to see as to how that translates into real ability to be able to reach out to those or to be able to, get those resources. And that seems to be not that easy or possible even. Okay, so I cannot really quote you great examples of that happening. So whatever renewable we have done mostly has been on our own. Okay, I know that great technology exists all over the world and great companies exist all over the world, which would be, which should find it easy. So how do we make it easy for them to be able to access markets like Pakistan is the question. So you have to look at, the cost of them coming in and how to enable that from policy interventions. So those policy interventions at the international level through the MDBs, through the multilateral development banks or through other means doesn't happen.
And at the beginning of this, you started talking about the difficult situation kind of geographically that Pakistan finds itself in, the different countries around it. One notable example, obviously, Afghanistan that you mentioned. Now, when the Taliban first took power again in 2021, many commentators expected that Pakistan and Kabul would have a relatively comfortable relationship, or at least it would be cordial. However, there's obviously been a series of clashes on the Pakistan-Afghan border, as well as a spate of terrorist attacks from the Pakistani Taliban, who are presumably operating in Afghanistan. So it looks like tensions are beginning to rise between the two countries, or at least it's less easy than some expected. How do you expect that to develop between the two nations?
Okay, first of all, that presumption was based on the myth that Pakistan had some fascination with a certain entity or the other, right? So I think that myth, hopefully after a year, should be happily broken. But beyond that, I think, look, Pakistan has always maintained, not from today, not from 2021, but from ever since I have known our policy or followed it, that we do not have a choice but to deal with whoever has power in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And we do not have favorites. We cannot afford to have favorites because we are a country which has a 2,600-kilometer border with them. We have a country which has tribes on both sides of the border. We have a country where people typically like to come and go quite easily, but we have a country which are sovereign, and that is where the line is drawn. And the other sovereign country is Afghanistan, and therefore the visa regime, the passport regime has to be applicable, and therefore the fence has to be made. Now, where we are right now, in my reaction to when you said that, why are you not doing the European line? Every country has to defend its own positions. Pakistan's first obligation is to its own people and to their own security. And if you feel that security threats are arising from one neighbor or the other, it is our job to ensure that that threat is taken care of. Okay, and that everybody works according to the obligations that they've made to the international community, to us bilaterally, that they will not allow their soil to be used. So this is the basis of. So no country can be expected for good relations or the pretense of it to. But we understand and we continue to engage with them deeply, and we feel that our lines of communication are rather open and well. But that's a threat that has been left behind because of the vacuum. And I don't know who to blame for it. But I think rather than let's look at who to blame in what time, we need to just forge forward and make sure that we are able to provide our own citizens the security that they deserve and desire.
And one of those sources of conflict between the two countries is obviously the TTP terrorism that we mentioned. Do you think the West and the UN potentially as well should be doing more to support Pakistan in its fight against terrorism?
Obviously, I do. Okay, but more than that, I think I think we just keep on going from one adventure to the next and have no time to absorb what has been the pieces and the literally, almost like post an earthquake type of conditions that are created once these interventions happen, and what they leave behind. And then we go and take the same, forget about all the commitments that were made to the girls, to the women, to the democratic values, to everything, and then happily move on and happily justifying it and saying, deal with it, right? That's not responsible behavior. That has consequences. That has consequences of lives. So please, the values that we project, that we talk about, must be followed, okay? And I cannot understand, I consider this to be irresponsible, highly irresponsible. Because it may not be a European life. An Afghan life is also a life, right?
Yeah.
And so many of them, and so much chaos, and so much instability has been very costly. And that costliness doesn't end on the border of Afghanistan, unfortunately. It envelops the entire region. I would be concerned even if it was in Afghanistan. And then you have this nice, interesting way of narrative shaping and moral outrage, which is, of course, we can't do business with them because they don't allow. And would you like the girls to starve then? Because there will be no humanitarian assistance going, and forget humanitarian assistance, their reserves would be frozen. And I have no love lost for anyone, but I do have love lost for the Afghan people, 40 million of them. So it's remarkable to create conditions in which we enable the starvation of people. That cannot be okay, just because it's not in the news anymore. And the cameras have moved away. The column writers have moved away. The think tanks have moved away. It's literally like a whole industry just moves from one to the other. But we are left to face the consequences. So it's not a pretty sight.
Finally, we obviously touched on this already, the floods in Pakistan recently. It's been reported that since the flooding, Pakistan has been seeking debt relief from some of their international creditors, including China, who represents about 30% of Pakistan's national debt. Considering this, do you think that we need a new format for international debt relief in order to support developing countries better, especially given the growing tensions between the Paris Club and China?
Okay, so when we say it has been reported, it's because we're not sure of what we're saying. Yeah, no, I don't think Pakistan has formally asked for debt relief from anyone. But when it comes to debt relief itself, currently in the circumstances that have been created because of the food crisis and the oil crisis, this has a huge impact on almost every developing country. Certainly in Africa, certainly many countries in South Asia, and perhaps many countries in Central Asia also, and beyond. Now, what that requires is international reaction. What that requires is to look at debt relief or the burden of debt, which has been exacerbated because of the food crisis and the oil crisis, especially the oil crisis. Countries like Pakistan, 25% of our budget on oil imports. When oil imports suddenly become really, really dearer by hundreds of percent, what do?
Sure.
Right? So I think it's exceptionally important not to let this confrontation of China and the Paris Club and everything else, and some of it, or most of it, I would say self-created confrontations, to come in the way of really looking for solutions. Because if you don't intervene now for a larger group of countries, then the cost of intervention later on will be far higher. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. It's been really interesting to hear your perspective directly from you. Thanks for coming.
Pleasure.